we spend a lot of money pumping the corruption in Afghanistan. The Afghanistan military, obviously, it was riddled with corruption, but it was also riddled with ghost soldiers. So
Hmm.
those were troops that only existed on paper. So commanders would pocket their salaries. These people did not exist, right? So that was one of the biggest scams in the Afghan military, and a major reason why also the Afghan National Army collapsed so quickly when the U.S. withdrew. That's not really talked about either. So they had fake enlistments. So the commanders would register non existent soldiers and pocket their salaries. So these ghosts, so to speak, were on the official payroll but never actually served because they didn't exist. If a soldier was killed, the officers wouldn't report it. So instead, they kept collecting their pay. And also, as far as the equipment and supplies go, since funding was based on troop numbers, they were inflating these numbers. So that meant more money for weapons and food and fuel and uniforms, most of which was stolen and sold, right? So, with all this corruption going on, did the US officials know about this? Because there were reports as early as 2016 warning about these ghost soldiers, but did the politicians ignore them because they wanted to show progress or
Oh, they did know. They did know. But at the highest levels, it was falsified. It was lied about. We have to understand this is not an Afghan thing, that this is an American thing. But there was no interest, for obvious reasons, at the higher levels for doing anything about it. Officers who would go to Afghanistan would spend a year there. So you spend 3 or 4 months figuring out what's going on. Then you have a shock maybe of a couple months where you're like, oh my God, this is really what it's like. Then maybe you try and do something about it and realize all you're going to do is get yourself in trouble. And then you've only got 3 or 4 months left before you go home. And then, and that's the cycle that occurs over and over again. I mean, it was laughable what this was like, because every year, as say new police or army advisors from the Americans or the Brits or the Canadians or whoever would rotate into Afghanistan, the same Afghan commanders that had been supplied, say, with cold weather jackets the year before, were saying, I need new cold weather jackets. We don't have any, right? I mean, so because it was such a racket. I remember my time in Afghanistan. At least two, maybe more Afghans said to me, "We call this the golden time because it's a time to get the gold." And it wasn't just the military side; it was the development side as well, the reconstruction side, which was a massive scam, a massive racket. I remember going to a town in northern Zabul province where they had four of the same buildings. They had four municipal buildings that different American units had built one after the other, right? Probably paid the same contractor to build the same building four different times. Right? There was a green one, there was a blue one. I mean, like it's comical, but it also shows that intersection of war and profit at the acute point. So it wasn't as if those four municipal buildings had been built because they had been blown up one after another, were blown up by Taliban. No, they just built it because it was just good business sense by the contractors on the ground to take advantage. And the other aspect of it too. So in Afghanistan, you would see these small American outposts or British outposts or Canadian or Danish outposts, and there'd be 20 or 30 NATO troops there, and probably less than that, 10 or 15 Afghan troops, and they'd be completely surrounded by resistance forces, by insurgent forces, and you'd say, if these guys massed, they could easily overwhelm this garrison here. And there are two things. One, they didn't want to. The resistance, the Afghan, the Taliban were always careful about American and NATO air power. They didn't want to do anything to bring in airstrikes on it. You see where they would occasionally, and they'd lose a lot of guys, and so they were hesitant to do that. So you have a little garrison out there, and say there'd be, say, again, 25 American soldiers. There'd be a American lieutenant there, 15 or so, 20 Afghan soldiers, and that American lieutenant would be able to spend maybe $2, $3, $4 million a year on reconstruction projects in and around his little garrison. So you go meet with these young officers, and you'd say, hey, tell me, what do you control? How much of this part of your area of operations, what do you control? And they'd say, we can control what my machine guns can hit. That's it. That's all we control here, right? And then so you say, why are they still standing? And again, they don't want to, the insurgency doesn't want to mass because of aircraft. But the more important thing is because this thing is an ATM machine. This thing is a gold mine because they're pumping out millions of dollars every year in reconstruction projects. And I remember in Zabul, one time the teachers didn't get paid, and the guy who ran the education ministry in Zabul province, his brother, not even his brother-in-law, his brother was a well-known Taliban commander over in Wardak province. So when the money that came, all in cash, of course, because there's no banking system there, money that came for the teachers didn't go to the teachers, just disappeared. Where do you think that money went to? One of the major funding sources, maybe the biggest funding source for the insurgency, was the American and NATO money itself. By the time, say, that money made it down to that district in Afghanistan where those municipal buildings are being built, you're talking about 10 or 20 cents on every dollar actually makes it there. First of all, with the American money that was appropriated for reconstruction, about 40% of it never even leaves the U.S., goes right to overhead and management costs. Right, I mean, so So you talk about 150 billion dollars appropriated for the Afghan war to rebuild Afghanistan. 40% of that never even left the U.S. Right, never even, and then it gets to Afghanistan, and I don't know, 20, 30, 40% more goes into American salaries in Afghanistan. Right, for the people who are over there working, and then as it passes through the Afghan system, everybody takes a cut. And this is how you get down to you're going to build a school in some district someplace in Afghanistan, and 10 cents out of every dollar. But then we even know that most of those weren't built. So another great journalist, Azmat Khan, as well as the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, they did audits as well. 80, 90% of the things that USAID and the United States military said they built in Afghanistan were never built. Azmat Khan went out there looking for all these schools, and the schools weren't there. The Special Inspector General sent people out looking for healthcare facilities and everything else, and they weren't there. 80 to 90% of what was said was built couldn't be found, right? So, people understand, how does this thing go on for 20 years? Well, I mean, that the going was good. I mean, we would describe it in the U.S. as, it was the gravy train with biscuit wheels.
The work can make you rich for sure. It makes me also think about all the charities that you donate to. On average, when you donate to a charity, a large portion goes just to administrative costs like staff salaries, office expenses, fundraising efforts, right? So, for example, I think the American Red Cross, which is one of the most honest ones, by the way, spends around 30% of its revenue on administrative and fundraising costs. So it leaves roughly 70% for the core program. Now that's the best case scenario. That's the honest one. And also this system of think tanks. As I understand that think tanks are actually funded by the weapons industry that reinforces the need for the funding of the military industrial complex. And you see them doing the economic and ideological. So they would go to Congress and provide justification for the funding. So how does the cycle work? I mean, this is lobbying Congress. And I assume it's not think tanks only, but it must be a good return on investment. This is legal bribery, basically. And it also seems like a very close circle of people, right?
It is. And a lot of it is. So, in terms of this, to talk about lobbying for a second. So, from 2001 to 2021, the official years of the global war on terror for the United States, the United States military, the Pentagon was given $16 trillion from 2001 to 2021. Of that, roughly half went to the weapons contractors, right? Roughly half of that went to the Lockheed Martins, the Raytheons, the General Dynamics, etc. So $8 trillion. During that time, those companies spent about $1 billion lobbying. So you talk about return on investment. In 20 years, they spent $1 billion lobbying. They got back about $8 trillion, right? I mean, it's the return. It's clear how this works. The idea of legalized bribery, absolutely. That's the American system. That's the American reality. We have a government that is a government that can be purchased. Policies can be purchased.